My parents pressured me into paying my sister's wedding while I struggled, so I cut ties, and what happened next left them speechless. I'm a 26-year-old guy, and I've always been the hard-working one in my family. From the moment I landed my first job, I made a promise to myself that I'd never rely on anyone else for my future. I live in a modest apartment a few miles from my parents' house, juggling a low-paying job that barely leaves me enough for rent, groceries, and the occasional night out. Every paycheck I earn goes toward building something of my own as safety net, a little savings for emergencies, maybe one day a home I can truly call mine. I take pride in being independent, in knowing that I can handle life on my own terms, even if it means late nights, skipped weekends, and the constant hum of stress. My parents, though, have always had a soft spot for my sister. Ever since she was little, they praised every achievement, every little success, and showered her with encouragement that often left me in the background. I don't resent them. They've worked hard, but it stung sometimes. While I quietly paid for my own tuition, saved my first emergency fund, and picked up extra shifts without complaint, my sister's accomplishments always seemed louder, more celebrated, and somehow more important. I learned to shrug it off, telling myself that loyalty and consistency matter more than recognition, and that eventually my hard work would speak for itself. Early contentment came from knowing I was responsible, reliable, and capable. I may not have been the center of attention, but I was building a life I could be proud of. And for the most part, I was happy with that. But lately, there had been whispers. Casual mentions over dinner about my sister's big news, vague hints about engagements, and offhand comments about plans for the future that didn't seem to involve me. I didn't think much of it at first. It was just talk, and I assumed it wouldn't cost me anything, or so I told myself. Deep down, though, a tiny knot of unease had started forming, one I couldn't quite shake. Something told me that the easy balance I'd built might be about to tip. It started like any other weekend. I came home from work, exhausted from a 12-hour shift, just hoping for a quiet evening. My parents were buzzing with excitement, their voices louder than usual in the living room. My sister, beaming, had a ring on her finger, and the words hit me all at once. She was engaged. I smiled, genuinely happy for her. She deserved love. She deserved happiness, but there was an undercurrent. I couldn't ignore it. Then came the first subtle hints that things weren't going to be simple. My dad casually said, "Of course, we'll need to talk about how everyone's contributing to the wedding." I nodded slowly, trying to hide the twinge of worry creeping up my chest. My mom chimed in. "It's traditional for the family to pitch in. You've been doing so well for yourself, haven't you?" I laughed nervously, but inside I felt the weight pressing down. My doing well barely covered my own rent, my savings, my bills, my sister. Oblivious to my concern, chatted happily about her dream wedding, the flowers, the venue, the guest list that already sounded bigger than our entire apartment building. "I just want it perfect," she said, her eyes sparkling. I smiled and nodded again, swallowing the first wave of resentment forming in my throat. It wasn't her fault. She had no idea. As dinner went on, I realized this was going to be more than just a casual conversation. My parents kept dropping lines about family obligations and how proud they were that I could help make her day special. At first, I brushed it off, thinking they were exaggerating. But the more they talked, the more I felt the creeping tension in the room. By the end of the night, a quiet realization had settled in. This wasn't going to be simple. I wasn't just supporting her emotionally. My parents seemed to expect my finances to be part of the celebration. And though I tried to tell myself it would be fine, the little knot in my chest tightened. I could feel it, the first hint that my independence was about to be tested in ways I hadn't imagined. Over the next few weeks, the subtle pressure started creeping in, almost imperceptibly at first. My parents would casually mention flowers, catering, and dresses when I was around, always finishing with a line like, "Of course we know you'll help, right?" I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was imagining things. But deep down, a quiet unease was growing. Every time I brought up my own expenses, my rent, my utility bills, the small savings I was carefully stacking, they waved it away as if I were being selfish one evening. My mom sat me down while my sister was out with friends. "We just want what's best for the family," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You've been so responsible all these years. It would mean a lot if you helped make your sister's wedding perfect." I nodded, unsure if I should argue. My words felt heavy in my mouth, but I tried anyway. "Mom, I've barely got enough to cover my own expenses. Not sure I can." She cut me off with a sigh, a hint of disappointment that made me feel small, like I was failing before even trying. The tension grew each day. My sister, completely oblivious, would casually mention extravagant Ideas designer dresses, a live band, a guest list that seemed to stretch endlessly. I smiled and encouraged her, hiding the gnawing worry at how I could possibly manage all of it. Sometimes I would sit alone at night staring at my empty savings account, wondering if being the responsible one always meant getting taken for granted. And then came the first real signs of manipulation. My dad would leave offhand comments, like, "We all know you've been doing so well. You can afford a little more, right?" Or, "It's just what family does for each other." The words were casual, but they carried weight. I realized that this wasn't just about helping it was about expectation, about being the family's financial scapegoat. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was going to get worse before it got better. By the end of one particularly tense week, I sat on my couch, phone in hand, staring at my bank app, heart sinking. The wedding wasn't just a celebration anymore. It was a looming storm. And I wasn't sure how I would survive it. It hit me like a punch to the gut the day my parents laid out the full wedding budget. I had been bracing myself for a contribution, maybe helping with flowers or covering a few small costs. But what they were expecting was beyond anything I could have imagined. Every detail from the venue deposit to catering, photography, and even a designer dress for my sister was now supposedly my responsibility to help cover. I felt my chest tighten, the weight of panic settling over me like a physical force. I tried to reason with them, cautiously opening my mouth. "Mom, Dad, I can help with some things, but I don't have that kind of money. I'm barely keeping up with rent and bills as it is." My dad waved my concerns away with a laugh, like I was exaggerating. "You've always been the responsible one? This is just a small contribution. You're doing well for yourself, aren't you?" My stomach sank. Small contribution? They were talking about tens of thousands of dollars. My sister, oblivious to the tension, skipped into the room with a grin, showing off a wedding dress she'd already reserved. She hugged me and said, "Isn't this going to be the best day ever? I can't believe you're helping me with all this." I forced a smile, but inside I felt my world shift. This wasn't about family anymore. It was about being expected to sacrifice everything I had for someone else's dream. And then came the bombshell, the first real twist. While I was checking my finances, I discovered several loans had been quietly taken out in my name. My parents had assumed I would cover them, never bothering to ask. I felt a mix of shock, betrayal, and rising anger. It wasn't just pressure anymore. They were actively manipulating my life, putting me at financial risk without my consent. By the end of that night, I sat alone in my tiny apartment, staring at the numbers on my screen. The wedding had become a looming nightmare, a storm I wasn't sure I could weather. And deep down I realized this was no longer about helping family. It was about reclaiming my life before it was completely consumed. The unease in my chest had grown into a knot that refused to loosen, and I knew things were about to get far worse. The weeks that followed were brutal. I picked up extra shifts at work, staying late into the night, my body screaming for rest, while my mind ran calculations over and over. Every paycheck was swallowed almost instantly by bills and wedding costs I hadn't agreed to, leaving me hollow and exhausted. I skipped meals, canceled plans with friends, and even put off small things I'd been saving for a short trip. A new laptop, anything that might give me a bit of breathing room. All of it was disappearing into a black hole of expectations that weren't mine to carry. At home, the pressure didn't relent. My parents dropped in, unannounced, to check on the progress or casually mention another cost they assumed I'd cover. "Oh, we just ordered extra flowers. You'll cover the difference, right?" my mom said one evening, smiling as if it were nothing. I nodded, my jaw tight, hiding the rising frustration behind polite words. Inside, I was seething, heart pounding. Every time they walked through my door, knowing that any refusal would be met with guilt, comparisons to my sister, and disappointed sighs that cut deeper than any argument. Even my sister, completely unaware of my struggle, would text about wedding plans with excitement, showing me dresses, venues, and elaborate decorations. She had no idea what I was going through, and the thought of disappointing her made the weight even heavier. I found myself lying awake at night, staring at my ceiling, wondering how much longer I could keep juggling my own life while being financially exploited by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. The mental toll was growing alongside the financial one. I started snapping at small things, my patience thinning, my confidence eroding. Each reminder of the wedding and Instagram post about bridal gowns, text from my sister, a casual comment from my parents was a needle in my chest. I felt trapped, like I was sinking in quicksand. And no matter how hard I tried, there was no solid ground beneath me. By the end of one particularly long day, I realized the choice looming ahead was unavoidable. Keep sacrificing myself until I broke completely, or stand up and risk everything I'd known about my family. The tension was unbearable, and I felt a quiet, terrifying certainty that the next move I made would change everything. I didn't know exactly when it happened, but something inside me snapped. After months of juggling bills, loans, and endless wedding costs, the exhaustion and resentment had built into a simmering rage I could no longer ignore. One evening, while reviewing yet another expense my parents expected me to cover, I stumbled across an email that made my stomach drop. They had been bragging to relatives about how much I was contributing every cent. I'd scrimped and sacrificed was now being flaunted as a badge of their family's generosity. I felt a wave of betrayal wash over me. It wasn't just financial anymore. It was public, humiliating, and manipulative. I confronted my parents quietly that night. "Why are you telling people about money I didn't agree to give?" I asked, my voice low but trembling. My mom looked startled, then defensive. "We just wanted everyone to know how responsible you are," she said, but the words felt hollow. I realized in that moment that my parents had never truly cared about my well-being. They cared about appearances. The manipulation went deeper than I thought. I wasn't just being pressured, I was being exploited. The midpoint twist hit harder when my sister, completely unaware, chimed in with a casual, "Wow, you're really helping me out a lot, huh?" Her innocent excitement cut like a knife. She had no idea her wedding had become a battleground I was losing control over. I felt trapped, suffocated by guilt, obligation, and betrayal all at once. That night, sat alone, staring at the ceiling, the room silent except for my own ragged breathing. I thought about all the extra shifts, skipped meals, and drained savings, everything I'd sacrificed. The breaking point wasn't just financial. It was emotional. I realized that if I didn't take control now, I'd be drowning in a life dictated by my parents' demands. Losing not just money, but my sense of self by the time I finally went to bed. I knew something had to change. The choice was clear. Continue being their pawn, or finally stand up and reclaim my life. But the thought of cutting ties, of defying family expectations, filled me with a mixture of fear and an unfamiliar surge of empowerment. I just didn't know how explosive the fallout would be. The next weekend, I finally gathered the courage to confront my parents. My heart was hammering and my hands were shaking, but I knew I couldn't keep burying the anger and exhaustion any longer. "I can't do this anymore," I said, voice low but firm. "I can't keep paying for a wedding that's not mine to fund, and I'm done being manipulated into it." Their faces shifted instantly. Shock, disbelief, and a hint of irritation flickered across their features. My mom leaned forward, voice sharp. "You're being selfish. You've always been responsible. Don't you want to do the right thing for your sister?" I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady. "I have been responsible for myself. I'm not saying I don't care about her, but this isn't right. You've been exploiting me for months," my dad huffed, waving his hand dismissively. "Exploiting? We're your family. We thought you'd understand what family means." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years of overlooked sacrifices pressed down. Family doesn't mean sacrificing yourself until you have nothing left. I've been paying your debts, your loans, and my own expenses, and for what? So you could brag to relatives about my contributions? That's not family. That's manipulation. The words rang out loud in the room, and for a moment silence fell. My sister, standing nearby, looked between us, confusion written all over her face. She opened her mouth, but I cut in. This isn't your fault, but you need to see how this has affected me. I'm done being your financial backup plan. The tension in the room was suffocating. I could see the panic and disbelief on my parents' faces, the first real crack in their armor of control. By the time I walked out of the room, I felt a mix of liberation and dread. I had said what I needed to, but the fallout was just beginning. The house felt heavier when I left, filled with unspoken anger and shock. I didn't know how my parents would react next, but one thing was certain. I couldn't go back to the way things were. The path ahead was uncertain, and I could feel the storm gathering, ready to test every ounce of my resolve. The days after the confrontation were tense, silent, and unbearable. My parents tried calling, texting, even showing up at my apartment unannounced, each attempt dripping with guilt and manipulation. "We just want to talk," my mom would say, but I knew better. I wasn't going back to being their emotional and financial doormat. Something inside me had shifted, quiet, firm, and unrelenting. I realized that cutting ties wasn't cruel. It was survival. I started setting boundaries, blocking calls when necessary, and refusing to answer questions about wedding costs or contributions. Every message I ignored felt like reclaiming a little piece of myself that had been buried under months of pressure. The anger and betrayal still simmered beneath the surface, but for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of freedom. I was no longer their pawn, no longer their source of pride and bragging rights. The hardest part wasn't the financial independence, it was the emotional distance. I loved my family, or at least the idea of them, and walking away felt like leaving a part of myself behind. Friends offered support, reminding me that I had the right to protect my well-being. But loneliness still crept in at night. I would lie awake, hearing echoes of my parents' disappointment and my sister's oblivious excitement, wondering if I'd made the right choice. Yet with each passing day, I noticed a subtle shift. The panic and pressure that had defined my life for months began to lift. I focused on my work, my savings, and my small victories, rebuilding confidence that had been chipped away by manipulation. And though my parents continued to send messages filled with thinly veiled guilt, I remained steadfast, finally prioritizing my own future over their expectations. By the end of that first week of distance, I realized something crucial. Reclaiming control came at a cost, but it also gave me clarity. The knot of tension in my chest began to loosen, though I knew the hardest moments weren't over. The storm I had stepped into was only gathering, and I had no choice but to face whatever came next. It hit me harder than I expected, the loneliness. Cutting ties brought freedom, yes, but it also brought isolation. Friends tried to check in, but no one really understood the weight of walking away from your own family. Every social media post about my sister's wedding, every congratulatory message to my parents felt like a stab. I was outside looking in, watching the life I'd been pushed into continue without me. The guilt settled in, heavy and suffocating. Was I really justified in walking away, or had I overreacted? One night I sat alone in my tiny apartment, the dim glow of my laptop illuminating the stack of unpaid bills beside me. My savings were depleted more than I'd planned, and I realized the full cost of choosing independence. The weight of being both financially strained and emotionally cut off pushed me to a breaking point. I felt small, defeated, and utterly unseen. Even my own resilience seemed like a distant memory. Then came the unexpected twist that shook me. A text from my sister. She admitted she'd begun to see what my parents were doing, how they had been manipulating me for appearances and treating me like a wallet rather than a son. She apologized for not noticing sooner and said she supported my choice to step back. That small message was like a lifeline. It reminded me that even in my darkest moment, there were cracks of understanding and solidarity. Still, the rock-bottom feeling didn't immediately lift. The loneliness, the fear of permanent estrangement, and the creeping worry about what my parents would do next gnawed at me. I felt torn between relief and despair, between empowerment and isolation. As I closed my laptop that night, staring at the shadows on the walls, I realized something. The worst was behind me only in part. I had fallen to the lowest point I could imagine, but now, if I survived this, I would finally be the one in control. And somewhere in that thought, a tiny spark of determination flickered ready to grow into the fire I would need for the next step. Slowly, life began to shift. With the immediate pressure lifted, I focused on rebuilding my own stability, catching up on bills, replenishing savings, and throwing myself into work with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. Each small victory, each late-night project completed, reminded me that I was capable of more than my parents had ever given me credit for. The sense of empowerment was intoxicating, even if tinged with lingering resentment. My sister, quietly supportive, became a surprising ally. She started speaking up subtly when our parents tried to manipulate the narrative, reminding them that I had boundaries and that my sacrifices weren't theirs to exploit. It was shocking to see her shift from oblivious participant to tentative protector, and it gave me hope that I wasn't alone in seeking fairness. Their previous control over my life was weakening. I could sense the unease building in them. The real turning point came when I noticed the change in my parents' behavior. Calls that used to carry guilt trips now had an edge of panic, their words clipped, carefully chosen. It was clear they were realizing that the person they had always assumed would comply without question was no longer theirs to manipulate. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and caution. I knew better than to let my guard down too soon. For the first time, I could see the path forward. I would continue protecting my independence, but I could also assert subtle influence without giving them power over me. Every saved dollar, every firm refusal, every boundary I maintained became a small victory, a message I didn't have to speak aloud. By the end of the week, the tension in my chest had eased slightly. I was no longer drowning. I was standing, slowly, deliberately, finding solid footing for the first time in months. But I could feel the storm wasn't completely over. My parents weren't done. And the final reckoning, the moment when they truly realized I wasn't theirs to control, was still looming just over the horizon. The first time I saw my parents truly speechless, I felt a mixture of relief and quiet vindication. They had tried every trick calls, texts, emotional guilt, subtle threats, but I remained unmoved. When they realized that no amount of manipulation or pressure could bend me back into their control, the shift was almost tangible. Their faces betrayed it: surprise, frustration, and a deep, unspoken acknowledgement that the rules had changed. I didn't need to say much. My actions, my steadfast refusal to be exploited, spoke louder than words ever could. My sister, who had begun to understand the extent of the manipulation, quietly stood by me. She didn't need to intervene overtly, but her acknowledgement mattered. It was subtle, a shared glance, a message of thanks for holding my ground, but it reinforced that I wasn't alone, that someone in the family finally saw the truth. That alone gave me a sense of justice I had been craving. For the first time in months, I could engage with my life on my own terms. I invested the money I hadn't wasted on wedding extravagances back into my self-rent. Bills, small treats I had denied myself, even a modest savings boost. Every dollar spent felt like reclaiming a piece of freedom, a silent protest against the years of emotional and financial manipulation. When my parents tried to reassert control, the usual guilt trips fell flat. Their incredulity only highlighted their powerlessness. They couldn't pressure me, embarrass me, or manipulate me anymore. I had become untouchable in ways they hadn't anticipated, and it was almost poetic to witness the very same people who had once dictated my life sitting in stunned silence, realizing their tactics had failed. By the end of this chapter, I wasn't just free, I was empowered. I had defended my boundaries, reclaimed my life, and shown that no amount of expectation or manipulation could dictate my choices. The sense of triumph was quiet, almost internal, but it burned fiercely inside me. And in that quiet triumph, I felt the first real, lasting relief since the nightmare had begun. Months later, I can finally say I've reclaimed my life completely. I'm still the same hardworking guy, but now I'm also fiercely independent, confident in my boundaries, and unapologetic about protecting my own well-being. My apartment feels like a sanctuary rather than a place to hide from family expectations. I budget carefully, invest smartly, and focus on my future, not anyone else's idea of what my life should look like. My parents have tried to reach out occasionally. Their message is more cautious, even polite, but I remain firm. I respond only when necessary, maintaining boundaries that were non-existent before. The shock and silence on their part is a daily reminder that the power dynamics have finally shifted. I no longer feel guilty for prioritizing myself, no longer shrink under the weight of family obligations. I didn't consent to my sister, and I have developed a new understanding. She respects my choices now, and while she still loves her parents, she quietly supports my independence. I don't need to justify my decisions to anyone anymore. There's no resentment in our bond, only clarity and mutual respect. She's even begun questioning the old dynamics with our parents, recognizing that the favoritism and manipulation weren't fair to either of us. Looking back, the journey was painful, full of betrayal, emotional manipulation, and the suffocating pressure of family expectations. But the hardest moments taught me something crucial. My value isn't measured by what I can give others, nor by how well I can sacrifice myself for appearances. My autonomy, my peace of mind, and my dignity are worth far more than any external validation. Sitting in my apartment now, I feel an overwhelming sense of empowerment. I built my life on my own terms, and no one can take that away. I've healed, I've grown, and I've drawn the line that protects me. The storm has passed, and for the first time in years, I'm free, completely free. And in that freedom, I found the peace and satisfaction I never knew was possible.